James Bowey's work explores issues of human rights and social connection. He has spent his career covering a wide range of global and national stories, from the war in Bosnia to Hurricane Katrina. His photography and writing have been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Associated Press, as well as numerous exhibitions. His recent work focuses on using art to create empathy and bridge social divisions. When Home Won't Let You Stay is one of his many current projects and was on display at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library in February and March of 2020. The project premiered in Minnesota in 2016, and it's been traveling around the United States since then. The exhibition consists of contemporary color portraits accompanied by first-person poetic stories that create an empathetic experience of the plight and resilience of refugees working to make a new home in this country. In recent years, global and national events have prompted debates in communities across the country about our duty to refugees, our American roots, and to national identity. As part of every exhibition, James presents a community program, which is what we're doing tonight with you. And this is a program to consider the refugee issue, our responses to the needs of displaced people around the world. And for tonight's virtual event, we hope to create a community conversation in which he will share stories and photographs, as well as powerful reflections on migration, empathy, and human connection. And because we are also living in unprecedented times, we are absolutely going to be talking about how this relates to COVID-19 and what we're all going through together right now. So with that, I would like to thank James for bringing his work to the library. Thank each of you for viewing the work. Especially thank the community members and visitors who shared their stories with us. If you saw the exhibit, you know that we had a story wall that allowed people to tell us their own personal stories. And we got some great responses there, which we hope to share soon. And without further ado, James, welcome.
Hi, thank you all so much for letting me join you tonight, wherever you may be. I'm so grateful to be able to join you tonight and talk about this project tonight. In particular, I'm also thankful on behalf of the refugees who have been and made up this project and this work. I was very fortunate enough for refugees to sit with me and share the stories of the biggest trauma of their life. And they did that with a faith that those stories would make a difference and that by sharing that story, other people would be impacted. And it was in that faith that they shared that story with me, and that faith is realized by your presence here tonight. And so thank you for that as well on their behalf. Tonight, what I want to talk about to you mostly is I want to talk to you about the central idea of the work, which is that each of us creates the world we want by the stories we share. We are always in a constant process of storytelling and story receiving. And in that process of what we select to hear and what we select not to, we're creating our culture, we're creating the quality of our lives together as a society, and we're also in many important ways creating ourselves and who we want to be. And for me, that's been the guiding light of what I try to do, is I try to go out with my camera and I find and collect stories, and I put those stories together into larger narratives that are presented as exhibitions or as theatrical monologues or as various other types of programs, as books and so forth. And so I collect stories and bring those together to try to bring them into community so that they can be discussed and be learned from. But most importantly, what I'm doing is simply serving the stories of others, that they have the wisdom, and that by tapping that wisdom and listening to that wisdom, we all get a little bit better every day. And for me, the story of refugees has been a story that has been a central part of my work. In fact, it was the formative aspect of my work. When I was a greenhorn photojournalist, not knowing much, I went and covered the Bosnian Civil War in the early 1990s. I really didn't know much at all, and I got on a plane and arrived in Bosnia and met my fixer Mirko, and we drove around and covered this very, very difficult civil war. It was a civil war that pit people together who had been neighbors and friends, and in some cases even family. And in that process and what that was to engage that so deeply, I found my own path. And in particular, one day I was out looking with my fixer Mirko, and we came across a school that was abandoned. But the closer we got, we noticed this school in a small town near Mostar had some strange activity. There was movement inside. And so we went into the building and we discovered that this burnt out building with no windows and no electric and no water had become the makeshift shelter of refugees. These are refugees that had fled the fighting, and now they were living in the middle of winter. It was about 20 degrees air temperature, with just the coats on their back, huddling in the rooms throughout the building. There was a pot of water in the front hallway. The gymnasium was just a sewer of feces and urine, and they huddled and rocked back and forth to stay warm. And as I went by one of the rooms, I looked in, and there was a woman sitting there, and she was clutching a photograph, and she was rocking back and forth. And as I got closer, she looked up and she held up this photograph. And it was a photograph of a man with blue bathing suit on and his hands on his hips and a big smile as he stood on the beach in front of the Adriatic Sea. And she explained to me that he was her husband. And she described for me in great detail about how he was lost. And in the space of a few days, she had fled after the death of her husband and the death of her children from the fighting. And she looked at me and she said, "Would you please take this story so that he will not be forgotten?" And what she meant was to take a photo of this photo. And so as I was setting up in the light, I was trying to get an exposure, so my back was turned to the room, and I eventually got an exposure that would work. And as I stood up and turned around, there was a line of widows clutching photographs, waiting for me to take a picture of their picture. And each of them would always say the same thing. They would say, "Tell our story so we will not be forgotten." And in many ways, that became then the purpose of my work, to try to fulfill that promise, to tell their story so they will not be forgotten. And in serving that, I've tried to make some dent in the stories of others in a variety of ways, in a variety of places around the world. But that particular story of refugee that I've tried to serve really took a turn in 2015. Things really started to change in the way we were talking about refugees. Refugees started to be talked more about in terms of threat as opposed to people who are coming for opportunity. We were talking less about how we help, but rather how we hold back. And that change, the change in the language that we were using, for me was a signal change. It was telling me that there was something different about the way we were relating to each other in our country and in our communities, that who belonged and who didn't was taking a new urgency. And so I felt that I had to tell that story. And so I went out and I did what I do. I got in my gray Subaru and I began to go out and start finding and telling the stories of refugees. And one of those refugees, one of the first people I met, I'd like to share with you, is Sam. And I'm going to pull up her photograph for you right now. And Sam, I met her in Mankato, Minnesota, and she shared with me what had happened to her in Mogadishu, Somalia. And she said, "Life in Mogadishu was chaos. The groups were at war. Everybody had guns. There was random fighting and killing. Our neighbors and cousins were killed. Every day we were living in fear that something would happen to us. I couldn't stay." And in many ways, Sam speaks for a much larger group of people today. She speaks for a group of people that now numbers over 70 million. That is 70,800,000 people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes worldwide. This is a 2018 number that will surely skyrocket from the various actions that have happened in the past year. But what this means is that there are 70,800,000 people living in ways similar to this. If refugees were a country, they would be one of the largest countries in the world by population, larger than Great Britain and just behind France. And in 2018 alone, there were 13.6 million displaced people, which comes to one person every 2 seconds. But yet, around the world, there is another tide, if you will. There's another current going on. And that is that while we are experiencing something that is one of the most displacements in history, there is also a reaction to that displacement. And in communities and countries around the world, there has been a strong backlash against the acceptance of refugees. Refugees have become something that has become politicized, has become a strong political issue for the 2016 election, and it is seen by all accounts in our country and otherwise in other places to be one of the driving forces that will shape the 2020 election here and abroad. And we see this taking place continuously. This is a photograph from February near a refugee camp where vigilantes were taking to breaking up and dispersing a refugee camp on their own. That this tide of hate towards refugees is growing. Along the American border, while we've cut down asylees from allowing them to come into the country and enforcing them to wait before they can seek asylum, we're seeing situations like this near Tijuana as asylum seekers are piling up in makeshift tents near the border. And as this happens, we also consider that for refugees, we have severely limited the number of refugees. We set an official cap for 2020 at 18,000, which was the lowest number ever for refugee resettlement in the history of the refugee resettlement program. But that number was in fact quite a bit lower because it also allowed for individual locations to deny refugee resettlement in their communities. And in fact, the governor of Texas became the first governor to say that he would not resettle any refugees. That's been challenged in court, but it has set up a situation where refugee resettlement was being brought to a virtual halt. And then of course, with COVID-19, all immigration now has been stopped for the foreseeable future. So it raises questions for us. It raises questions for how we want to think about what it is as a country and what it is to have a connection to refugees. But I would say is fundamental to that is what we're really having is a discussion about what we mean by refugee. That refugee is a term that has different meaning for different people. In most cases, when we're talking about it politically, we're really talking about a legal term. That a refugee is someone who is given a legal designation. They've been forced to flee from their home, and the UN has given this designation of refugee. In order for that refugee then to move to another country, they then have to go through a vetting process. And there are currently 25.9 million refugees waiting to be resettled in another country. And in that vetting process, it's determined whether they meet security protocols, have proper background, what's the best place for them to resettle. That process usually takes about 2 years on average. And then those refugees, when they do resettle, come to and immigrate to their new country as a legal immigrant. So the process of refugee is a legal process. And then the sister category of that is asylee. An asylee is somebody who, rather than going to a third party area where they are given refugee status, asylees are people that go directly to a border and ask for safety, ask to be admitted. And that process of showing up at a border and asking for asylum is also a legal process. It's a legal process embedded in US law as well as international law. Asylees are the category that we're talking about when we're referencing what's going on at the southern border. Most of the people coming from Central America through Mexico and arriving at the border are people who are seeking asylum. So, but I think, as I mentioned, in many ways, what we're really talking about is the idea of refugees. That we are in this place where for many people in our country, they see people of need, while others see people who represent danger. While some see victims, others see enemies. And in many ways, I think we have become a country at odds with itself. That we see a fundamental idea, we see people in these very different ways that has become highly political, but highly identifying of who we are with and how we identify ourselves within our body politic. And I use this graphic oftentimes. This is a graphic that represents the polling of people who are for and against refugee resettlement. The solid areas are people that are for refugee resettlement, and the open areas are people that have polled primarily against it. And I think it's fascinating to me because to me it looks like that sort of a weave that's been in some way broken, a weave that has begun to become unbound in that way. And I think that calls upon us to think about this issue, about what we want to be as a country. But most importantly, I think it asks us fundamentally what we mean by belonging. That when we are at odds for who belongs and who doesn't, we're asking fundamental questions about what it is to be a community and what it is to be connected to people as people who have inalienable rights as human beings, who have certain dignities and certain connections. And so when that is put under pressure, it's a crisis for human rights. But also when we lose that sort of common normative language about who we value and who we don't, it's also a crisis for democracy. And so with those ideas in mind, I set out to talk to refugees, to take their photographs. And here is C, who I met in her kitchen in Winona, Minnesota. And she told me this: my dad got shot and we knew we had to leave. We lived for 3 months in the jungle without food. We eat leaves and bamboo. I get very skinny. I didn't think I would make it. Death became unimportant. For many of the refugees I talked to, if not all the refugees, they're very intimately familiar with that thin line between life and death. That what it is to be alive one moment and to lose that, the gift of that life the next, is something that they've lived in a very real and profound way. It's reflected too, I think, in Yatha, who I met in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was couch surfing, staying with a friend who was allowing him to use a spare bedroom for a few days while he has been looking for home and looking for shelter in the United States. He's a Karen, a Buddhist monk who's an ethnic Karen from Myanmar. And this is what he said: I was beaten and tortured by 6 people. I was bleeding from my ear, my eyes, and mouth. Around 11 p.m., they took off my clothes and threw me in the river. I was floating unconscious all night. There was one girl who witnessed what happened. My body was found about 7 in the morning. The whole village thought I was dead. I survived. To me, Yatha speaks in this beautiful and unimaginable story, beautiful for his perseverance, unimaginable for the violence that he's incurred. But he remembers one thing. He remembers this girl standing on the beach, watching and witnessing it. And I think often about who that girl is and how she must have been moved by that, but also is her active witness. And that in many ways, that's where we're all called to, is that witness, that we see things that happen and we don't always know what to do about them. And we're called to make sense of that and to give that back in some way into the world. And so in that way, this project has been a little bit of an active witness. It is presented in a variety of gallery spaces. Here it is in a large projection installation. And here is where people can walk through the exhibition in this way. Here it is in a traditional gallery space. You see here it is at, of all things, the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. And in all these places, we bring people together to share stories from themselves and to take those stories out into the world and share those. And then as part of it, there's also a theatrical program that has a monologue and live music and spoken stories by members of the community that is presented, and that we were planning to present in the library until we had to find another way to do it. And but most importantly, what we do is by bringing stories into community and into dialogue, we then bring people together to share. And when people begin to share, when people who are unlike each other stop and listen and question and learn, amazing things start to happen. And so that's what I've been doing with this project. And by way of a short introduction, is just trying to bring stories into dialogue. Hannah Arendt, the great German political philosopher and refugee, says those beautiful words in which she says that things are not humane just because they're made by human beings, but we make them so by bringing them into dialogue, by bringing them and talking about them. And in the course of talking about them, we learn to be human. And that idea of learning to be human and learning to be human with each other, I think is one of the most profound things that we ever do, and is the basis for this project. And I hope the basis for the conversation that we'll have tonight as we dig deeper into each of these stories and what they have meant for me and what I hope they mean for our communities as large. So that's as a little bit of an introduction to get us started, and I'll start turning it over to some of our other moderators and to you to bring in questions so that we can go deeper into the work and share that with each other.
Thank you for that wonderful context for all of your work, James. That's a wonderful, wonderful introduction to everything we'll talk about tonight. And to everybody who's here with us tonight, some of these ideas that James just mentioned, they've resonated with us so much throughout the last 3 months of working with him, the last several months of working with him, and in bringing the exhibit to the community. We really believed strongly together that this is an exhibit that is about stories, and that the library is a place for stories. The stories not only in the books that you take out and that you bring home and that you read, but the stories that you bring to us, and the stories you exchange with each other, and the stories that are created in the library. And the way James presents the work really gives you an opportunity to take in that story based on your own experience. And that's what I hope we'll learn from you a little bit tonight. Those of you who have seen the exhibit will learn how you reacted to those stories and how you interacted with them. Thank you to Terry, who told us in chat how proud she was to see the exhibit and how proud that she is that the library presented it. So James, because I think this is one of the things that's truly at the heart of the stories you're telling, in your unique experience, why are people so divided today?
Yeah, that's, I would say if any question sort of informs or shapes my work, it's that question. I've really tried to devote myself to working as someone to help bridge division. And in this particular project, that was a goal that I made literal to myself. That I wanted to tell the stories of refugees, but I also recognized that there was another challenge, and that was that in this hypermedia world that we live in, it seems that while we have access to more information than we've ever had, we have seemingly less common understanding of that information. That in fact, information has become something more to be weaponized, something to confirm an existing bias or to gird yourself in your respective positions. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and there's a lot of reasons why that is happening in terms of where we are socially at the moment, the advances we have in communication technology and so forth. And so I felt that it wasn't enough for me simply to go out and tell a story, but that I had to tell it in a certain way that tried to bridge that division. And so this project in particular is trying to answer the question of how can art help bridge division. So as I do with all projects, in my course of driving around and meeting people, I was also doing deep research. I was interviewing experts and learning. And asking myself this question of what is it that divides us? We say we're divided, but why? And I think that for me, the most important thing to kind of think about is that when we talk about division, that means many things. Politically, division is often cast in terms of polarization, that we're the most polarized, meaning that people are more on the various ends of the political spectrum and tend to congregate further in the extremes than they do in the middle. In fact, recent survey data shows that we are more polarized today than at any time since the Civil War and Reconstruction. But that division is also playing out in interesting ways personally. A 2016 study, I think, found something quite profound, which was that 1 in 6 people are no longer speaking to a close friend or relative since the 2016 election. And that really kind of sets up this tension that I think we all feel, and we can all sort of point to a certain division, if you will, but I think articulating that division, particularly for people like me, and I think all of us making sense of the world today, is a little bit harder thing to articulate. So what I think is important in this particular case is that there's a very big difference between division and disagreement. The disagreement is something that is fine in a normal functioning society and normal functioning relationships. We disagree. We have a democracy that is organized for disagreement. But this is something else. That this is what we're seeing is disagreement moving towards hate and division. In a 2016 Pew study, they found that 47% of Republicans said that Democrats were immoral people. 35% of Democrats said the same thing about Republicans. And why this is important is that we are seeing people as fundamentally less human in the human qualities that we prioritize. And what we're saying is, and you hear it in the language all the time, we're hearing it amongst politicians and other people, is that we refer to the other side as an existential threat, meaning they're a threat to our existence. And when something is a threat to your existence or a threat to your identity, that sets a very, very different set of hurdles and a very different set of problems and issues. And as someone who covers conflict and covers these human rights issues, I can tell you that that's really the central issue. And I think that if we're to understand it, the thing that has sort of given me some understanding about why we're divided is I think we need a new frame about how we think about this. I think that what we often are using the frame that we've learned in school and learned in our experience of sort of the Enlightenment, that teaches us that as human beings, reason is the thing that makes us human. What distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom is our ability to reason things. It's that Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am, and that we are rational animals. But what contemporary research tells us is something quite different and something quite a bit more complex. And so when we're trying to solve these problems with the idea of the Enlightenment, that the idea that we appeal to reason, you know, as a journalist, as someone that began as a journalist, my idea was that I go out into the world and I gave the story, and when I bring the story and I drop it off, my work is done, because that will engage reason and the right outcomes will follow. But we've learned, of course, that that is not the case at all, and that in many ways, facts and information have very little to do with the opinions that people hold and the actions that people take. And so I think where the most interesting work is, and the most elucidating work, is really now at the intersection of neuroscience and social psychology. And there are people really working as kind of social neuroscientists. And they have found some things I think that are really interesting. And that is that as an evolutionary matter, as a neurological matter, we are wired for prejudice. Every one of us, no matter how open we are, no matter how considerate we are, no matter how we think of ourselves, we are fundamentally wired for prejudice. And the neurological reason for that is that when we go out into the world, our brain can only process so much information at one time. So our brain, as a processing shortcut, is not seeing every detail, but rather categories of detail. And this is particularly the case when we are assessing threat. So that as we're going out into the world and we're engaging the possibility of threat, both consciously and subconsciously, we are in a constant process of categorizing. So in our ancient ancestors were going through the marshes and going through the fields, and if they're walking through and they see a category of grass, it's fine, but suddenly if a tail pops up, that's a new category. It's that tail fits a certain category in their mind, which is danger, and they react. And so fundamentally, all animals, and particularly human beings, at the amygdala, at the base of our neck, is our amygdala very quickly and unconsciously is constantly filtering by category. And so we are very much our categories. If you see a young woman in a hijab in an airport, and your category is as a terrorist, you are going to feel fear. If you're someone else who sees as a young woman in a hijab as your sister or your cousin, you're going to have a very different reaction. So we are constantly in this process of prejudice, of prejudging based on these categories that we carry around with us, that we respond to through our amygdalas. But then also something else happens is we have, as we've evolved, we also evolved this much more complex brain, this much larger brain that has a prefrontal cortex that we use for reasoning. And so those same categories then go through a complex process between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex in which they're processing and reasoning whether that category is true or not. And what scientists have found is that that connection is where this division happens. And how we manage that connection is the key to whether we can overcome division. Most importantly is that it's about context. So when people are given lots of messages, negative messaging, fear messaging about a particular group of people, when they have that reaction to somebody, they might see somebody on the street, or they might hear about somebody in a news story, a different category of person. They will react with their amygdala, they will react quickly, prejudiciously, etc. But if we are able to change the context in which people are considered more by their individual experiences, then we begin to see them without the amygdala, and actually we see them in a much more reasoned way. So for example, scientists have done studies where they ask, in one case they had white subjects seeing an African-American man, almost all of whom, when seeing an African-American man and asked to identify his age, they showed heightened activity in their amygdala. When they asked those same people they showed them an African-American man and asked them to think about what his favorite food is, that same activity was changed completely. When they thought about him as an individual with individual experience and individual desires, they saw them, and there was no difference in activity between white people and black people in those test subjects. So what this means is that we have to consider the context, the society that we're creating. And of course, we have created a very hyper-tense, hyper-media society in which we're constantly getting messages and responding to messages very, very quickly. And depending on the media and the place we choose to consume our media, we're getting a barrage of messages that set a context, that are the basis for division and the basis for maintaining division. So it's a long answer to a short question, but the truth of it is that I think for all of us is that, to me, it gives us all a sense of humility, that we are not quite the reasoning people we think we are, that we need to be open to the fact that we are wired in certain ways for prejudice, and to try to cultivate those other ways, that we are also we are also people of reason and moderation who can see people with open and considerate arms and ways of viewing them. And so we're both. We're a duality. There aren't people who are purely one or the other, but we are people in conflict and in tension that we try to work through as individuals and as a society.
How would you say, knowing all of that, through all of the research and all of the experience you've had, how does that impact the way you take the photographs?
Yeah, so, as I told you then, as an artist with any project, I'm trying to come up with a language. So as an artist, I have an intent or an idea, an objective that I would like to create. In this case, I'm trying to bring down those barriers of division. And so with any work, as a visual artist, you're working through figuring out what is going to be the language of that particular work given the objective, your objective intent. So I have an idea in my mind that I hope that viewers will feel in theirs. And so I have to come up with a way of communicating that. So when this project began, it began like every other project, which is that as I'm going about and doing my research and meeting people and taking photographs, I'm also thinking about how can I get this strong feeling that I have, this thing that gets me out of bed and away from my family and has driven me to try to tell this story. How can I tell it in a way that's going to impact other people? And in this particular story, that came about in a very quick and profound way. And I'll share with you a photograph that I think will illustrate that for us pretty well. So when I was, one day was in the midst of this project, and I came across and met a young woman by the name of Czaijka. And this is Czaijka. I took her photograph in her home in North Minneapolis, where she lived with her family. And in the course of our conversation, this is what she said. I was 12 years old. All I remember is the shouting, and I see my uncle killed. That's all. And my mother screaming. Now, what was unique about this story and why this story had such particular resonance for me and why it shaped the story and shaped the project that it became is that for Czaijka, that was every single word that she told me. That she was a young woman who had suffered unspeakable trauma. Her parents had said to me earlier that she had been a very vivacious young woman who had been kind of the heartbeat of their neighborhood in Baghdad. And she was full of joy, but after that experience of seeing that in such close range, she became a woman of very few words. And so for her to meet and talk with me was in its own way an act of heroism. For her to relive that with me was profound, and I felt that and I saw that in her face, and I hope that you all saw that in her portrait. But so I was leaving though, and I had finished that interview, and it had taken over a half hour, and that was every word she had said. And as I was going out to my car, I felt just dejected because this was such a profound story, but I had so few words to use, and I was telling these stories in the words of refugees. And I just was mad at myself, and I thought that I had failed as a professional, that I should have done better at this. And, you know, now what was I going to do? And by the time I got out to my car and I was loading my gear, I had a very, very different reaction. Suddenly I realized that, in fact, I had it all. That those words said everything. Those few words said everything that I needed to know. And in that way, that opened my mind to a very different way of seeing this, that it opened my mind to a different way of feeling and thinking about this, that in those few words, I could feel everything I needed to know. In particular, what touched me was that last sentence, which she says, almost as an aside, when she talks about what she remembers, and my mother screaming. When I was 13 years old, when I was a teenager, my father went missing, and we could not find him anywhere. And this was prior to cell phones. We couldn't call him. We didn't know where he was. We called highway patrol. We called everybody we could think of, everybody my father knew, for hours and hours and hours. The day went by, and the day turned into night, and we had no news and no way of finding him. We'd exhausted all of our possibilities. Night became midnight. We still had no sense of where he might be. And then in that late, the dark night that I considered as sort of that 2 o'clock hour, we finally came up with it. My mother, after we'd exhausted every possible name we could ever think of, my mom remembered an aside of my father talking about a person that he had worked with. And she just knew his last name. And so we called information. My dad was at that point working in Columbus, Ohio. He was commuting back and forth. He had taken a new job from our home in Wheaton. And we called information and got the name of everybody with that phone number. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, we literally took out our finger and we reached out and touched one and called them. And it was the person who knew my father. And with that, we had a little bit of grasp of hope, and he went searching for my father around Columbus. And one thing led to another, and we eventually got a phone call, and my father had been found, and he was dead. And my mother screamed. And I will never, ever forget that scream for as long as I live. And in that way, in that moment, with Czaijka, I understood what she was saying. That now a middle-aged white guy and a young woman from Baghdad could understand the same experience, that we could understand that as a shared experience, the shared experience of remembering the scream of your mother. And what I was unpacking for myself and for the project and for the work that I'm trying to share to you, with you all, is empathy. That while we are in so many ways divided and susceptible of division, we also have this capacity for empathy. And that in that way, we have that ability to see the position of another person, the experience of another person, as if it was our own. Empathy comes from art criticism, meaning to feel into. It's a German word. We feel into, that we understand the intent of the artist, and as the viewer in our experience, we bring that to the piece of work, and together in that process of dialogue and feeling into, we understand the shared motivation, intent, and experience of that work. And that capacity is what then became the language for the work. That I had discovered what for me was the language of empathy. That I could begin to bridge this division by presenting things in a way that had the viewer engage the work and engage their empathy. And this is fairly tricky. So what I did was then I used very spare images, as you see, just using light and shadow as much as possible. And then that's the reason then that the words are very minimalist. So by using these very open-ended poems that I find in the transcripts from their interviews, it allows then this open-ended interpretation by the viewer. In other words, it allows the viewer's empathetic imagination to fill that story in and to connect that story. And in that process, empathy then enables reasoning. That we're not really these reasoning people that we think we are on the front end, but rather when we're engaged empathetically, that's when reasoning comes in. The center of the brain that it registers empathy is located in the prefrontal cortex, right near the center for reasoning. And so in this process, these are both connected in these profound ways. The scientist Yuri Hassin made I think really a fascinating discovery. He puts people into MRI machines and has them tell stories to each other while he registers their brain activity. And what he found is that when a person tells an unscripted story to another person, their brain will register certain things in certain areas. So for example, if they said that they had stubbed their toe today getting out of the shower, that would show heightened activity in the pain centers of their brain. But most interestingly, and I think profoundly, is it would also show increased activity in the pain center of the listener's brain. And in this way, we literally link brains with each other as we're connecting across story. That in the scans that he has, the brain activity looks almost the same. And he calls this phenomenon neuro coupling, that we actually are wired for this kind of empathetic engagement where we experience what is going on with another person as if it is our own. But Yuri Hassin also found something else, which is that empathetic connection, I'll call it the empathetic connection, is also easily broken. And it's broken by what I term the dominant mic. If there is a superseding message about somebody or something, that ability for us to connect in empathy is thwarted and reduced. And of course, I mentioned that earlier in my description of what happens neurologically in division. And so what I propose for all of us tonight as we think about this, as we think about these issues that are important to us, is that what our task is to reclaim empathy, to create that context of bringing people together in ways that engages that kind of empathetic connection. And so what I'm trying to do in this particular project, by having spare photographs and these spare, what I call found poems, that are just these pieces of minimalist text that come out of their interviews, I'm trying to exercise our empathetic imagination in a way that allows us to understand the story and the plight of somebody else without division, without separateness, but in a way that we can understand much more deeply.
Thank you for sharing that. Since we do have some participants tonight who had not had a chance to see the exhibit, and since you have described so wonderfully how you approach taking the photographs, and since we know that the stories that you present with them are just an abbreviated version of a longer experience, can you share a few more of the stories or the photos with the stories behind them?
Sure. I will pull up a few for us. And so I've got pulled up 3 photos and stories I'd like to share with you. The first one is Mohanad, and I think each of these stories, I think, tells us a little something about the project, a little something about that we can all glean from and glean something special from. So Mohanad was living in Baghdad and this is what he said happened. Before the war, I had a good life and a good job. One day I received a letter at the door with a bullet in it. Get out, Sunni, from this holy place. You have 72 hours to leave the country. I fled with my family and left behind everything I owned. In talking with Mohanad, he explained to me that he was a middle-class businessman. He had an electronics store. He lived with his wife and children in a comfortable home in Baghdad, and they had a good life. They were looking forward to a good future. He had everything that a middle-class American would want and hope for in life. And literally one day, a bullet arrived, and it changed everything. As he says here, he jumped up, and in 72 hours he was gone. He left everything he had worked for behind. When he fled Iraq, he had to do what every refugee has to do, and that is that you still have to find a way to make a living. Refugees are often in situations where they have no rights, but yet they still have family support, they still have food to buy, etc. And so what Mohanad did is he taught himself how to cut hair. And he became a black market barber. He would cut hair in alleyways and in people's living rooms and anywhere that he could where he wouldn't get caught because he didn't have a license to work, in order to make the cash to buy food, to pay for the health care for his children and so forth, and to survive. And another thing had also happened to Mohanad, and that is that right when he was when he had this bullet arrive, he was about to finish his final exams for a degree that he had been working at. So he was about to complete his degree, but was not able to because of having to flee. And when word got back to his professors in his school, they told him that he could come back, he could finish his exams and finish his degree, but he would have to re-enter the country and come back to the school to take his exam. And he did. And under the threat of being killed, he snuck back in. He lived with people that he trusted. He snuck in long enough to take his exams and sneak back out of the country again as a refugee. He passed his exams, he got his degree, and as I like to say, he has ruined it for every student that I will ever have, because there will never be an excuse good enough to cover what Mohanad did to finish his degree. And as you saw that photograph in the background, he is photographed in his, photographed in the barbershop that he started in North Minneapolis shortly after he arrived in the United States. And I'll show that to you again. It's a beautiful story of just perseverance and will. And this is Ayan. Ayan is a refugee from Mogadishu, Somalia. And I found my interactions with her always to be just profoundly ennobling. And she has talked in many cases about this particular issue and subject with me. And this came out of her interview when she said, I was 12 years old. I wore my best dress like we were taking a trip. But fleeing means you let go of everything you can't carry. First, it was the photographs and clothes, then the food and water. You get to the point where you can only carry yourself, and death would be better. Somehow you continue. Ayan was a young girl, and she thought they were going on vacation. She, like many young girls, wanted to take everything with her. She wore her best dress. She brought her stuffed animals, as she mentioned, she brought photo albums, brought things that she would bring as if she was going on vacation. But she found very, very quickly that that was not going to be the case at all. In fact, everything that she was carrying with her, she would not be able to hold on to for long. The dress that she had made her vulnerable to being assaulted by soldiers and others on the road. And so she very quickly had to get rid of her dress. All the things that she couldn't carry, like photo albums and stuffed animals, had to be discarded. And then she described the process of walking hundreds and thousands of miles and having to make the decision to what to let go of next. She ultimately then had to make the decision about whether you continue to carry food or water. You need water to survive, but water is heavy, and you need food to survive as well. But food doesn't take care of what your body needs for water. So you're in this untenable situation of having to make a decision. Do I get rid of the food and hope that I'll see some on the road so that I have enough water? Or do I carry food knowing I'll have another meal, but then hope that I get water? Imagine what that's like, to be stripped of everything, to making the decision of whether to have food or water for the next few hours. But then she also described, in many ways, the most profound loss that every refugee encounters at various times. And that is often the question of whether they can hold on to the people that are closest to them. In the case of Ayan, she described the terrible, terrible decision of having to decide whether she could continue to carry a young niece that she had been carrying when she herself could not take another step. And she described seeing the same situation play out as she watched parents having to make that terrible decision of could they carry their own child another step when they themselves were too weak to make another. Imagine what that is, to make that decision, but whether, and to be reduced to such a point that you have to decide whether you can hold on to another, to the person that you've loved and cared for in this world. That in many ways is what refugees teach us, is they bring us to a direct encounter of those vital things that we're called to understand as human beings and we're called to carry out. And her story has brought that home to me many, many times. The last one that I'd like to share with you as well is the story of Solomon. This is Solomon. And this is what he told me. After my father was jailed and beaten, we fled to Thailand. We lived in a tent along the border for 25 years. We moved whenever the Burmese military came across or the Thai police raided our camps. A refugee is someone who cannot depend on anyone. I think about Solomon's story a lot, and I draw your attention to a couple things. First of all is he says, we lived in a tent along the border for 25 years. I think that oftentimes we think of refugees as people who are some way coming across our border, that we have to keep them out because they're invading our border, that there are large groups of people on the move. And while people on the move do represent a certain number of asylees, and they certainly represent people who have been, boat people and others who are on the move, and refugees are continuously on the move, the vast majority of refugees are living in tents in the third world. And they're living there for decades and decades, that people are born and married and having children and becoming grandchildren while living in tents in areas around the world, 70+ million strong. And so I think that Salwan's story for me brings home what it really is that we're talking about, that what refugees aren't people as necessarily as physical threat, but they're people living in tents. But yet he says this rather haunting statement at the end when he says a refugee is someone who cannot depend on anyone. I think this is a profound call for each of us, that it is predicted that we will see upwards of 200 million refugees by 2050. And that it now is to the point that it becomes impossible for us to ignore the growing number of refugees, but also is that it becomes morally impossible for 200 million people not to be able to depend on anyone. And then what Salwan calls out to me, and I bring into conversation with each other, is that there has to be a better way. We need a new understanding of our relationship with refugees and how refugees can become parts of our communities and what that connection is.
Thank you for that, James. I do want to ask one more question, and we have some very nice comments that our participants are sharing about empathy. So I do want to make sure we open it up to them too. But I know that in moving the program from March 20th to May 1st, a lot in the world has changed in that time. We were in a position where we couldn't have the program in person, where we can't be together right now. So as somebody who has accrued such a unique experience traveling internationally, connecting with people with these unique stories, thinking about empathy, thinking about bias, what does all of this mean for us right now going through COVID-19 together throughout the world?
Yeah, I think that the experiences and the lessons of refugees are particularly relevant at this time. And I think they're particularly relevant on a couple levels. The first level is that we need to embrace this challenge that will continue to change and challenge us in different ways in the coming months, with the humility of understanding that we are categorizing people. That same issue that we brought up in terms of the divisions around refugees, those same fundamental things that make us human, and also part of the challenge of becoming fully human, are certainly there in this as well. And that is that we, when assessing threat, categorize for its danger. And that's turned out to be the case with COVID, and it's turned out to happen in some very particular and interesting ways. One is that sort of a funny thing happened when I was out jogging one day shortly after the regulations had gone into place about sheltering in place. You could come out to exercise, et cetera, keep distance. And I was running down the sidewalk, and a gentleman was walking his dog, and he pulled over with his dog to let me go by. And as I went by, he yelled at me, "You people need to run on the road." And now I was on Michigan Avenue, which in downtown Chicago, even with shelter in place, is not really possible for running on the road. But his comment really stuck to me. It was like, "You people." I was a category. I was something that represented as we're trying to figure out where we all belong in this. But the humorous part is I got home and I wanted to tell my wife this story, and I started to tell the story about this dog walker, and he said, "You people." And before I could get the words out of my mouth, she said, "Oh, what dog walkers, they're the worst." And of course, to me, what's funny about that is that we've already started to segment ourselves as dog walkers and joggers, and we've all sort of begun to look at each other according to these new categories. And of course, we do it unconsciously, but we should remind ourselves that that is our way of determining and categorizing based on whether something is important or isn't threatening to us. But it's not just funny. There are also some ways that it's manifested itself in some much more pernicious ways. And I would say The one in particular is the way and the narrative in which we began to look at who was vulnerable and who could die of COVID. And in particular, what that set up was a narrative that the people who were most vulnerable to COVID-19 were the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions. And it was a natural human reaction. I certainly did it. I imagine many of you did it, which was, how vulnerable am I? And as soon as there was a category to help us understand that vulnerability, we latched onto it. But when you latch onto that category, something begins to happen. And as you noticed, then we started having discussions about, well, if we open up the economy, and then the Lieutenant Governor of Texas comes out and says, well, if I was elderly and I was going to die, I would die in behalf of the economy. And these are when we start categorizing, I suspect that if you asked elderly people that same question, and elderly individuals, they might not have quite the same faith in that idea that he did. In other words, we start categorizing people, and then those categories start leading to what we consider to be acceptable solutions, instead of seeing people as individuals like ourselves, instead of seeing people with empathy. And what I'd like to do is maybe come to, and so that process begins, it continues, and that in that humility we continue, and when we can see it, make it real, I think it helps us begin to process the many dimensions of what this is all about. But most importantly is the other side of that. And the other side of that is that people have behaved in amazing ways. That what COVID-19 has also shown to me is this inherent ethical sense of people. This sense that, we are all part of an ethical web. And there's an instinctive understanding of that. When I see how quickly people adopted distancing, how quickly people have followed the various norms and protocols that they need to. And this is profound because for most people, statistically, the risk is fairly low. And the loss of work, of freedoms in terms of coming and going as I wish, when those are lost in many profound ways for many people. And so for people to take that loss on behalf of this web that I'm calling this ethical web, I think speaks so profoundly and brilliantly to our capacity as human beings, as ethical and empathetic actors in the world. And I'm touched by it over and over. And I often think of Martin Luther King's beautiful words when he, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, when he says, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And that is brought home so profoundly in COVID, in the sense that as long as there's someone suffering from COVID, there is none of us is fully safe. And when we understand that web, I think we take ourselves to a much better and profound place.
Thank you for sharing that.
I have a quick question about the COVID protests that are taking place now. What is James's take on that? Thank you for a very good conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that question. I've been thinking about that a lot. And we're going to get tight on time with our program, so I would also invite everybody, there'll be some contact information put out there. I invite all of you to reach out. I would love to continue this conversation with each and all of you in any way that we can. But I think that the protests, I think the refugee experience tells us a lot about, and a lot of ways to think about the issue of these protests. When we consider refugees and we consider our help for refugees, what I'm always touched by is the profound way in which the refugee who comes to the United States and is able to create a family and create a life, and then that life contributes to the community, and those children then are able to contribute back to their parents and the sacrifice that they made to become American citizens. They're speaking to something that is profoundly American, and that is the American idea of liberty. That the American conception of liberty is the absence of constraints and openness to others. Because it has to be. That the American conception of democracy was a rejection of tyranny and kings. And that what we were creating was a democracy with everyone with inalienable rights. But in order to do that, we had to have a particular notion of liberty. And that it was not simply an absence of constraints, but it was also openness to others. Otherwise, you simply have power. That if it's only absence of constraints, it's whoever has the most power to act the way they want to act. And then you see throughout human history, and certainly even in my work, is that the people who have the power are free and the people who don't have power are not. And America was an anecdote to that. And we understood that, and that we then symbolized that with a statue. And we put a poem on it. And we said, you know, give us your tired and huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And we said, bring us your wretched refuse. Today, those words are almost unrecognizable. No politician would ever say those words today. And so they ask us why? Why are those words on the Statue of Liberty? And the reason for me is that because in liberty, we don't know where greatness will come from. That we are open to each other because greatness comes from all quarters. But in that humility of being open to others, greatness is possible. And so when we are protesting and saying, for example, I saw a placard from one of today's protests that said, "My rights don't end when your fear begins." And I would answer or pose the question, actually, I think they do. They do in America, because in America, we are balancing both. And that if simply we can only act on what we want, that's power. And without consideration and without hope for others, we lose that vital conception. So what I consider those protests, and I don't want to be too categorical in this, but in many ways they represent, I think, a trend in American society currently in which we've broken freedom. That we call it freedom, but what we're really talking about is power. And that the best of our reaction to the COVID epidemic, the COVID pandemic, has been the beautiful way that we've tried to strike that balance between our individual freedoms to come and go as we please and to shop and maintain our businesses, and also that recognition that there's a limit to that freedom in how we help and support other people and are open to that.
Thank you for that. Very good question. I'd also like to invite anybody who is here who has told us that you visited the exhibit. If you visited the exhibit and you can find the raise your hand feature and you'd like to share, was there a specific photo that stood out to you most? Or can you tell us how you interacted with it? Did you take any of the story cards? Did you pass them on to people in your life? Did you write your story when you were at the exhibit? We would love to hear from anybody who would be willing to share that with us tonight.
I just wanted to say that when I was looking at each of the exhibit pictures, I just stopped and thought about, you know, I thought just the few words that were on each picture were very powerful. And when I got to the section where our own neighbors could write their stories, I thought it was fascinating how many people I actually knew that took part in that, and that opened up a further discussion amongst us. And I just want to say thank you for that. It was very moving.
Well, thank you, Amanda. It's as I mentioned earlier in the talk, you know, the great artist travail is how we suffer to try to come up with a language that we hope will impact people. And so when you say something like that, of course, you make my day and you make the project. So thank you so much for sharing that reaction.
Agreed. Thank you from the library too, because it's really helpful for us to know how people interact within the space. We've been fortunate to see how people take time with it. even with families with their children. Hopefully some of the book displays that we put together, including kids' books that you could read with your families to start to explore this subject matter. Hopefully those things helped you find a way to bring this discussion into your homes. But we have very much valued having this exhibit with you because it is really a community dialogue and interaction. Anybody else that wanted to share who had a chance to see it, or any questions for James about his body of work generally, or this body of work, or any of the ideas we're talking about tonight?
This is Lorraine. I'm watching it with my husband, Ed. What's next, James?
Oh, thank you. You mean in terms of other projects?
Yeah, yes, in terms of other projects.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as for this project, I'll reduce and then tell you kind of some of the other things that I have going on. So I am, it's a very interesting time for this project because it's based on presenting live, either exhibitions or personally. So it is definitely being challenged, and we're figuring out new ways that we're going to put on this work. So I'm always grateful for any impact or input from people as we try to find new ways to keep this work going now that we are limited in being able to present it physically to people. So that's my current emphasis, is trying to find that. And of course, the project is continuing to grow. So its national reach and international reach is something that's a big part of where I put a lot of my time and emphasis. In terms of different stories, I'm also involved in my sort of #1 story right now at the moment is mass incarceration, and looking at mass incarceration from that sort of deeper level of story, and looking at as people as individuals, and individuals with a story. And then the other project I have going on is an examination of inequality, and trying to look at what those stories are, particularly from the perspective of children. That in many ways, the future of a person is determined by their context in which they're born. That, of course, is very different than what we used to think of in terms of the American promise, that there was, when you were born in the United States, that there was sort of equal and unlimited opportunity. But in many ways, that's really, we know very, very quickly, if you know someone's biography of the neighborhood where they're born, where they go to school, who their parents are, that has a very, very strong determination on what their future is. And so putting those stories into ways that engage empathetically is the other project that I have going on.
That's excellent. We have time for one more, and we have one more hand up. So we'll go ahead and take one more question.
I just want to say that in my everyday experience with people, there's always been the conversations that looked for what's different. Somebody's ethnicity, somebody's clothing, somebody's way of talking with an accent or something. And I just love that what you have done makes me want to close my eyes and just look at the human spirit. And I think that's one of the greatest things to give to people, is to have them look inside to the human spirit, because we all have that. And we need to recognize that. And I really applaud you for what you've done. I'm so grateful.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And I love that idea of putting it in terms of sort of closing your eyes. And well, I got lucky, right? I got lucky because I had this idea that I was going to go out and try to tell stories, and that I was going to try to serve people by telling stories. But what it really happened was, and what continues to happen every day, is that I'm the beneficiary. I don't know how much good I'm doing in the end of the day, but what I do know is that I am made a better and more whole and complete person because of the stories of others and their generosity in sharing that with me. And when I can go to that place where I'm open to that story, I mean, so many times, we come in with our own prejudice, we come in with our own ideas, and we predetermine, and Czaijka is an example of that. I had an idea of what I wanted. But if you don't listen, you never get very much farther than that. And somehow, by some quirk of serendipity, on that day, which I'm not always good at, I actually listened. and I listened to something else that was happening inside of me because of the story that I was being told, and I had the gift of hearing. And so it's a discipline. It's something that we all have to work at every day. But I think that when we can literally or metaphorically close our eyes and be open to that, and the space of that story. And I think what you're feeling when you do that is you're feeling empathy. You're feeling empathy at work inside of you, which is actually energizing, as opposed to we have all felt the other, that reactive self that we have in our judgments, in our outrages. And when we allow that other thing to happen, it really changes everything. And it's very, very hard because we're not wired for that to be our first reaction. But when we can develop the discipline to listen deeper, not just for what I want to hear, but for what it's telling me, it changes everything.
Thank you to everybody who shared tonight. Thank you to everybody for being here tonight. James, I wanted to give you a chance to share any last words that are the parting words you'd like to leave your viewers with. We are so glad to have worked with you, so glad to have shown the work. And we know that it'll be an ongoing dialogue. We did have one question about whether or not people would be able to view the work again. And we are assessing every day how we're going to be able to open our building safely and when we can do that. So that is not something we know yet, but I thank you for asking it. And it's great to know that you are interested to see the work more. We will make sure that through James's site and other ways, you can still interact with it while we're closed right now. But James, please share any parting thoughts, and thank you to everybody.
And please, please feel free to reach out. I hope this for many of you is just the start of a conversation. I love emails. I respond to emails. So I will make sure that you have a way to see the work. And I will also be launching a newsletter soon, so that if you want to stay in touch and know where you might see it somewhere else in the area, see one of the live programs, etc. I would love to stay in touch with you. So please reach out. And if you want to see the work, I'll make sure you see the work if I have to bring it to you myself. So, so let's all try to make that happen. You know, you asked me something, if we can take a couple minutes, it looks like we have here at the end. Why don't we end on one more photograph, and I will show you that and try to leave us on something, I think, to me, which might be something for us all to think about in the coming week. So what I'd like to show you is one of the photographs from the exhibition, which is a photograph of Muhammad. And this is Muhammad here. And Muhammad said this. He said, "For 21 years, I lived with my family in a one-room tent in Djibouti. Very bad conditions, no running water, robberies, wild animals. My dream was to get a high school education, and I had to sneak into Ethiopia each year to go to school. It was easy to feel hopeless, but even if you can't see hope, you don't have to feel hopeless. Even if you can't see hope, you don't have to be hopeless." You know, I said earlier that I learn from every day from the people that I have the great good fortune to talk to. And I think that Muhammad's incredibly powerful description of hope is some great words for us today. They're great words always, but I think particularly today as we make sense of COVID. He says something that is essential, and he has an essential understanding of hope that I think we can all and could all draw from. He describes hope in a particular way. He says not something that you can see. He describes it as almost as a fortitude, as an action. What Muhammad used to do, he was living in a tent, or he would hop a train to go into and sneak into Ethiopia every year to enroll himself in school, because his whole ambition was just to be able to get an education. Living in a tent, nowhere else to go. He would jump on a train, hide on the roof, hide between the cars, get into Ethiopia, enroll himself in school, go to school, and come back out. He was mugged several times. He was victim of gangs. One time he fell off and he severely broke his arm. But he kept going because he believed in and wanted to get an education. And he describes it as hope. And that word is so important, I think, for us today. In many ways, in many quarters right now, there has been a discussion about whether we should be giving full and complete information about COVID. And one of the defenses of not giving full information or giving rosy information is that people need hope. And I think that's a profound misunderstanding of what hope is. That Muhammad and the scholars of hope understood hope as being something fundamentally human that is about fortitude. Václav Havel, the playwright and first president of Czechoslovakia, said that he found it as the middle ground between pessimism and optimism. That optimism was just, it was just feeling good about something without any basis, and the same that pessimism is feeling bad about something without any basis. But hope is this unique ability of of human beings to create potential despite the circumstances. And even if it may not happen in your own lifetime, but that your work every day is going towards something better for the future. That is what hope is, and that's what real hope is, and what I think we can all relate to today in a very profound way. But most importantly, is that hope, the hope of others, tells us what we can each hope for ourselves. That hope of one person is connected to the hope of all of us. And it's impossible to disconnect. If you encounter somebody who is in a difficult situation and filled with hope, you too have hope. If you encounter somebody who is hopeless, you too will feel less hope. And it's impossible to separate the two. But in many ways, that is how we belong to each other. Saint Mother Teresa says that wonderful thing is, if you want peace, you have to remember that we belong to each other. And that we belong to each other in this shared hope and this shared ability to come together and see a future based on the work and the effort and the fortitude that we put together collectively. And that all of us are engaged in this collective enterprise of shared hope, and in that way, making a better future. And I think that Muhammad's words have then particular resonance for us today. And so maybe as a way to wrap up, I hope in some way they resonate for you as well, that we think of hope as Muhammad does, as something that brings us all together and gives us the path and the fortitude for whatever future may come.
That's a perfect ending to a great evening. Thank you, James. And thank you everybody for participating. We will send you a survey so you can share feedback about your program experience, and we will send all of the things that are in the chat. So there are links to James on social media, to his website, and also this is a project that is ongoing. So there will also be a link if you would like to be a contributor to his project. That's something that we'll share with you in that email. But thank you everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and stay safe and well until we see you next time. Good night from the library.
Thank you all.